Welcome to the Harry Bridges School of Labor, presented by Labor United Educational League. Our purpose is to educate the workers of America on the strength of unions and to foster a class-conscious workforce. We aim to connect the struggles of the past with the struggles of today to empower the labor movement to transform from their present hopeless defensive fight into an aggressive attack upon capital. We plan to empower workers with knowledge, regardless of industry or type of work, bringing all workers to a class-oriented trade union movement. Just a reminder, when we break for questions and comments period, please keep all comments to 90 seconds. In order to keep our time schedule, we must enforce this time limit and need to cut off those who go beyond this limit. We'll give a notification at the 60-second mark. And tonight's class is on the case for public rail. And we have a guest speaker tonight, Adam, the national organizer for the Public Rail Now campaign. But before we go to Adam, would you like to say something to start us off?
I just want to thank Adam for joining us again. Last class was really good. And, I'm sure everyone is excited and who couldn't make it on Wednesday to have the class tonight. So thank you, Adam.
Thanks for having me. Okay, yeah, I can kick us off here if we're good to go. Thanks again for having me. I'm happy to be here. And yeah, last class was really great. So I'm hoping anybody who was present at the last class, if there's any questions that have come up since then, you can ask them. And anybody who wasn't there for the other class, then glad you're here now, and I can talk to you about the case for public rail. So yeah, I'll start off the same way I did last class with a quote from William Z. Foster. He, in his book, American Trade Unionism, he wrote, "In the early days, the federal government gave the railroads, after brazen corruption of Congress members, 160 million acres of rich farm, mineral, and timberlands, or a stretch of territory worth billions." And he continues, "Since the beginning of the railroad industry, its private owners have been paid back in dividends and graft many times the value of the roads. Yet, the railroads still belong 100% to these private owners, and they hope to go right on owning them regardless of how many times people pay for them." And he wrote that in 1938. William C. Foster wrote that in 1938. And so one of the things I brought up was, I wonder what his reaction would be to learn that the situation remains largely the same. So when we are thinking about really the development of, what we understand as capitalism today in the United States, when we think about that development, is really inseparable from the railroad industry. So the railroads were the first major capitalist enterprises in this country with national significance. And so when we think about the development of a national working class in the United States, again, it's inseparable from the railroad industry. So you have this, while other industries were still sort of fledgling, as far as mass production, these railroad companies were already massive corporations with equally enormous workforces. And the size and regional spread of this railroad workforce is key because the railroad workers were in the unique position to shut down industry on a national level. I always bring up, I have that picture there of the Great Uprising of 1877. That was led by railroad workers, and it was more than just a strike. It's compared to the Paris Commune. So I really like this idea of the 1877 Great Rail Uprising being the U.S. Paris Commune. And I include that quote from Mike Davis, who has a fantastic book called Prisoners of the American Dream. And he talks about how when you look at these mass struggles between 1870 and 1900, it's almost always starts with the railroad workers. So these national railroad strikes were supported not only by railroad workers, but thousands of other workers, sympathetic small farmers, workers in different industries. But the railroad workers were, because of how they were spread out nationally and how they had this ability to shut down industry, they were something of a revolutionary vanguard. So yeah, and again, so we can already see, like, from the end of Reconstruction, there's this titanic industry that's developed that's crucial to the growth of the national economy. with an enormous national proletariat that's making the gears turn and could also make them stop turning. And another thing I like to add is that when you look at the development of left or progressive labor politics, almost always they can be traced back to the railroads. That these different like progressive political parties or workers' parties, farm and labor parties, almost always have some connection to the railroad proletariat. So, and on that note, we can go on to the next slide. So it would take a lot longer than we've got today to kind of go through the whole history of the railroad unions and how they're structured. And so I'll just start with the American Railway Union, because this was kind of this was an answer that was developed by Debs and other similarly minded progressives and leftists on the railroad, where they saw just from the day-to-day, their day-to-day experiences on the job and in their positions as labor leaders and rank and filers, that the craft union structure of the railroads kept everybody separated. There's all these different jobs on the rail. And right now there's 12 to 13 different railroad unions. So, I call it it's a hangover of the sort of craft unionism of like 100, 150 years ago. And so the American Railway Union was thought of as a solution to that. It was introducing, it was one of the first industrial unions in the country. And it was actually one of the largest unions during its short life. But anyway, so again, there's these numerous jobs on the railroads. Every job has its own union. And too often these separate unions just step on each other rather than working together against the boss. And so Debs and others, they thought, well, what we can do is we need to unite all these different workers, regardless of their craft, regardless of their union, so that we can better fight the bosses. And so the American Railway Union was, again, this one of the first industrial unions in the country. It was founded in 1893, and in 1894, it won a great strike on the Great Northern Railroad. But unfortunately, that same year was when the Pullman strike happened. So if you know anything about the Pullman strike, you've got state violence, you really like horrible repression against the strike, the jailing of the leaders of the American Railway Union. And so that pretty much crushed the ARU. So by 1895, it had pretty much gone away. But so just kind of put a bow on that. So we have this massive industry, the railroad industry. We have all these different separated craft unions on the railroad, but we also see one of the very first attempts at industrial unionism. And I think, I'm not sure if this is where we go into a Q&A, but we can go to the next slide. Okay, cool. So nationalization, that in thinking about how massive this industry is, there were already people talking about why we need to take it out of private hands very early on. And there were these other examples of national railroad projects like the Baltimore, Ohio line. But the one that stands out for the purposes of Public Rail Now and Railroad Workers United, which I'll get into in a bit, was during World War I. So it was apparent that the private rail system was unreliable, it was insufficiently planned, it was prone to disruptions due to things like weather. It had all but stalled during the war, so it was incapable of serving the needs of the country during wartime. And the question as to the morality of that war, we'll set aside for now. But in any case, they were nationalized under the Wilson administration. And from all the accounts that I've read, the nationalized rail system was a tremendous success, and railroad workers, farmers, and shippers, and even though later on the shippers especially would turn against what we'll talk about in a little bit, the Plumb plan, it was overwhelmingly supported by the general public and by workers. And like I have mentioned in the slide there was an American Federation of Labor referendum. Even though Gompers and a lot of the more right-wing labor leaders were opposed to it, the membership of these AFL unions was like, oh my God, this is great. Yeah, we absolutely need to keep the railroads nationalized. And it's not even close. I mean, you can see the numbers there. And so every single rail union endorsed public ownership. And the Plumb plan, as you can see, there's the button I have there, the Plumb Plan League. There's a guy named Glenn E. Plumb. He was an attorney who was hired on by railroad worker organizations as counsel. And he saw that things like this labor shortage, the low wages, and all these sort of like the measures that were taken to increase profits at the expense of the workers and the public were the primary causes that behind the railroad system being a failure in private hands. And so again, in 1917, in December 1917, the Wilson administration took that advice and nationalized the rail system. And there was a organization called the Plumb Plan League that was developed to carry on that public ownership after the war. And unfortunately, it was returned to private hands in 1919. It was introduced to Congress in what was called the Sims Bill, but it failed to pass. But again, I just want to emphasize the fact that you had these labor leaders in the rail unions like Warren S. Stone. He was the president of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, very much involved in the Plumb Plan League. All these different rail unions and AFL unions outside of the railroad overwhelmingly supported nationalization of the railroad system, even voting against their leadership, which had wanted to return it to private hands, which is what happened. But the key point here is that it might be seen as some kind of radical idea, but it had overwhelming working class support. And it made total sense to the people that actually had to work on the railroads day after day.
And with that, we'll break for our first round of questions and comments. And just want to make a quick addition here, quick. Next month, our class will be on the Plumb Plan itself. So we're going to get a little bit more in depth on, working conditions of the railroad and the conditions of the railroad at that time, as well as the Plumb Plan, a little more in depth on the Plumb Plan itself, as well as its role in creating independent political action among labor.
Yeah, first off, I just wanted to thank Adam for coming on and doing this class. I mean, even the first section was tons of information, and I'm really enjoying it. My question was on Deb's attempting to amalgamate the railroad craft unions. Is that something that Public Rail Now and Railroad Workers United is also trying to do, or is that part of kind of the larger program of Public Rail Now as well? I was just kind of curious.
Yeah, definitely. There's some slides that'll get into that. But yeah, so just as like a teaser for what we're going to talk about in a little bit, but Railroad Workers United is carrying on that spirit of industrial unionism on the railroads. And Public Rail Now started as an RWU campaign, but has expanded into something larger than when it had started. But yes, absolutely. Industrial unionism is key. And the way that the railroad unions are structured and how they treat each other, it's one of the primary causes for the state of the rail system right now. But we'll get into more details there.
Yeah, and if you guys haven't noticed, Labor, we put out on Labor Today, our publication, this week, the video from Railroad Workers United that launched the Public Rail Now campaign that was put out last year. So if you have a chance, check it out. It's only about 10 minutes long.
Hey, Adam, long time no see. Super quick, I wanted to ask, out of curiosity, how was the early railroad labor movement in regards to social issues, like for example, dealing with minorities and including women, as opposed to, for example, the crafts unions of the AFL in its early days?
Yeah, good question. And I mean, unfortunately, you see a lot of the same sort of old-timey prejudices on the railroad, just like any other craft union at the time. Now, there were, depending on what labor leader or what they were trying to do, like the ARU, for example, it had problems with that. There were certain elements of prejudice against Black workers, for example. But I mean, given the time, it's not surprising. That being said, in thinking back about the 1877 Great Uprising, one of the major forces behind that was the Knights of Labor. And they really came out of that. And the Knights of Labor actually had a large membership of women, and it was open to Black workers. That wavered now and again, like it wasn't consistent. And there were examples of like anti-immigrant prejudice and things like that in the Knights as well, later on especially. But there's these kinds of like ebbs and flows of progressivism, and then the sort of reactionary tendencies that erupted at certain times. But I mean, we could have a several hours long discussion on that as well. But yeah, I'll just answer in short. Unfortunately, yeah, some of the typical old time prejudices in the labor movement were they were very much in the rail unions as well.
And thank you. There's no more questions or comments. We'll go to our next section.
Okay, so yeah, like I was saying earlier, so Railroad Workers United, it started off in April 2005 as an organization called ROCU, the Railroad Operating Crafts United. And really it started off as conductors and engineers that were belonging to the two big rail unions, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and UTU, which is now Smart TD, which is the sheet metal workers. Their TD is Transportation Division. So, and the BLE eventually came under the umbrella of the Teamsters, which is why it's BLET now. But they saw that this sort of craft unionism of, we only care about ours, whatever happens in engineers don't care about the conductors don't care about the engineers. A lot of stepping on each other instead of trying to fight the boss in a united front. So what ROCU was attempting to do was, well, they wanted to just get everybody in the same room basically at first, but it also had the ambitious goal of trying to actually merge these two big rail unions. And in 2007, ROCU was dissolved and Railroad Workers United was founded. So it kind of took its place. And rather than it just being between, the conductors and engineers unions, it was all the different rail unions. So Railroad Workers United is not a union. It is a rank and file caucus that is promoting the sort of unity that Debs and the ARU were talking about a long time ago. So bringing all these different railroad workers under this same industrial unionist umbrella and fighting for rank and file democracy, unity in all the crafts, and mass action as well. So that's and like I say at the bottom there, the shortest answer as far as what RWU stands for is it's carrying on the spirit of Eugene Debs and the ARU. And like I was saying earlier, the way that all these different unions, there's 12 to 13 different rail unions right now. And the way that they're structured, there's machinists, there's engineers, there's conductors, there's electricians. And they all work on the railroad, but they all have these different unions. And that's helped the Class 1 railroads, these major carrier corporations, divide and conquer. And we might be able to talk about this a little bit later, but you can actually see this at play right now. So like in 2022, they got the shit scared out of them because they saw that there was a potential for a national railroad strike that would involve all these different rail unions. But what they're doing right now is going from union to union, passing these tentative agreements. And it gets really messy when you even start going from like the national to the local and all this kind of stuff. But in any case, you just see it right before our eyes. This is what craft unionism gets you. The bosses are just going union to union and getting these tentative agreements passed and undermining any kind of national industrial solidarity among all these different rail unions. So RWU's response to that is we need one giant rank and file caucus that all these different railroad workers, regardless of their craft, regardless of their union, can meet and talk about their issues. And we can actually start developing strategies to address them, not just in your local, not just in your craft or your union, but across the board with the railroad workforce. So that's what RWU is all about. So I just was kind of talking about what the Class 1 carriers are doing as far as the tentative agreements and undermining railroad worker solidarity. But let's look at the state of the rail system, just from strictly economic or industrial standpoint. You look at the accident rate, almost 30% between 2013 and 2022. Okay, I mean that's astronomical. And in addition to that, we talked about precision scheduled railroading yesterday, or PSR. And I like to always bring up that railroad workers say PSR means pretty shitty railroading. And it really is, because it's essentially austerity on the rail system. It's gutting the workforce. It's not paying for any kind of expansion or maintenance of the equipment. It's even working towards automation, longer trains that break easier. They're longer and heavier. You've got 2-3 mile long trains. It's extremely dangerous. And so, in addition to that, you see attacks on like the railroad retirement system. Pay is lower. You work 12, 14 hours a day. You only get to see your family for, you got to plan on seeing your family for only like 8 to 12 hours at a time. And then you're back on the road for another week or so. And so it's no wonder why the workforce has gone down from 210,000 to 150,000 in 10 years. The really astonishing contradiction here is that the rail system, I say that it's strangling itself to death. It's because you see fewer and fewer carloads of freight. There's 30% fewer carloads of freight from 2023 or from 2020 to 2023. And you see more and more freight being shipped by truck, which if you are an environmentalist, or you live in a trackside community, or like you have noticed the congestion on the highways, it's catastrophic, because using freight rail to transport is far more environmentally friendly. It's not perfect, but it's also a lot less dangerous when you think about the impacts of having a bunch of semis on the highway, and there's more and more. And like I mentioned earlier, they're totally allergic to any kind of capital expenditure. So there was a study that was done in, I believe, 2017, where they said the rail industry would have to invest $135 billion in expansion just to meet the needs for capacity by 2035. They haven't done that. But what they have done is my final point there: $196 billion in stock buybacks and dividends, though. And on the next slide, we'll kind of see what that looks like in those pie charts there. So you can see this is just two examples of the Class 1's, Canadian National and Union Pacific. You can see the green there, the sort of bright green, and the a little bit darker green there. Those are buybacks and dividends. And then you see what track maintenance, capacity expansion, and equipment looks like. So and when I said it's really contradictory, it's because this industry is doing everything it can to basically destroy itself, and yet remains incredibly profitable. So you see this financialization of the rail industry, which is really frightening and also interesting in a sick way. But and you can see total railroad employment, how far it's dropped. There's a little bit of bumps here and there, but I mean, just from 10, 15, 20 years ago, you can see, I mean, it's gone down so drastically. I mean, if that chart expanded beyond 2013, it would be even more drastic. But and then like I was mentioning earlier, as far as the railroad accidents per million miles, so it's an industry that's getting more dangerous. It's shipping less and less freight, has gutted its workforce, and yet they're making billions and billions of dollars for their shareholders and their investors, and yeah, I mean, so it's really astonishing. And I mean, I can't think of too many other examples of an industry that's doing something like this.
And with that, we'll break for our next round of questions and comments. I am going to keep this slide up to hopefully trigger some questions. And as I'm looking at this, and I'm shocked that it didn't hit me Wednesday night, but it definitely hit me now. Railroad accidents per million miles. This graph ends at 2022. I wonder what it looks like having another 2 years added to it. Because at least it's been covered more in the news than it was, whether it's which gives me the impression that trends continued to that it's uptick. And given another few years, I'm sure we're not far away. If we're not there already, you're seeing a whole one accident per million miles more than it started here in 2013, which is scary.
Yeah, so I'm noticing like a huge problem here. I mean, the obvious one is like just the excessive stock buybacks, and it's a recurrent issue in multiple. I mean, like especially tech. It's all across the board with the US's major industries. I don't want to go too much into strategy here, but how can we, in our unions and also just in general, in our communities, fight back against stock buybacks? It seems like a colossal issue all across the board.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And that's, I mean, that's a huge question. So, um, I think really the education piece is huge, so, um, and I mean, we can go back to Foster. I mean, when we think about the sort of gap between communities and unions, um, like when you read about like when Foster wrote about organizing the steel industry, for example, just that educational piece is huge. He had advised like we should get folks speaking at churches. We need community groups. Like uh, it has to be beyond just sort of it has to go outside of the labor hall. One, I mean, educating union members is paramount, and I mean the railroad workers know about this, and workers in other industries do too. But there is, I think, this sort of disconnect almost. There's like a bifurcated like community union relationship, whereas it needs to be a totally united effort against capital in general. But in terms of what we have to do to accomplish anything, we know that bin and say, hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, you cut out for a little bit.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I was afraid that would happen, but yeah, got crap internet here. But what I was kind of saying, and I don't know where I dropped off, but it's going to take a mass movement of workers with the support of the broader public, and it's going to take a united labor movement to do any kind of actual to get any kind of tangible results out of it, because we're not going to legislate our way out of it. I mean, it's inherent to the very structure itself. Capital is going to try to increase profits in any way it can, even to the detriment of society as a whole. So
yeah.
it's as far as what we can do to stop the stock buybacks and things like that. Again, it's going to take an entire mass movement of people, at least in my opinion, and I think that's going to start with, like I brought up Foster earlier when he talked about organizing the steel industry. It's going to take workers going out into the wider community and developing those relationships. Unions have been like sort of cut off, like they are stuck on these bread and butter issues where there is a very obvious connection between the struggles that we face as workers on the job every day and the impacts to the wider community. So until we start building that relationship with the mass public, and we actually start applying pressure through strikes, boycotts, whatever we can do, there's no incentive for capital or their lapdogs in government to stop this. So it's a tough question to answer, but an important one.
Thank you, Adam. You did a good job, and I want to add a couple things. Of course, the main goal in ending stock buybacks is what we're all joining together in coalition to work on, and that's the nationalization of the railroads. But there was something that Adam brought up in his answer, and that's connecting the labor struggles, our struggles, to the rest of the communities and whatnot. And that's something that Public Rail now has, for those that don't know, has already started doing. We've joined in. We've had several members of Louisville join in on these organizing meetings, and one thing that's been pushed is working with what's called the Mask Off Maersk campaign. For those that don't know, Maersk is like the largest shipper in the world, and they are a large funder of Israeli attacks on Palestine. So Mask Off Maersk is a campaign that is started by the Palestinian Youth Movement, and it's to you know, push Maersk to cut its ties with Israel. So that is and Public Rail now has been starting to connect these struggles together. So that is, you know, the campaign is on its way to doing exactly that. But of course, we all need to get on board and help with that.
Yeah, the best thing to do is to get the public rail system nationalized. That's the best way to get rid of the stockholders. So, again, a really good reason especially when you look at this chart. The stockholders have to go, definitely.
Yeah, and I'll say that, and just going back to Amir's question, like he brought up tech. Yeah, and across the board with all these different industries, what we're trying to do with public rail now, that's something that needs to happen across the board with these major industries. If it's if it's too big to fail, it's too big to be in private hands. Okay.
Thank you. And if we have no more questions or comments, we'll move on to our last section. And this is the last section on the Public Rail Now campaign itself.
Okay, so yeah, just kind of picking up where we left off as far as the state of the rail system in RWU. So in April 2024, Railroad Workers United launched the PRO campaign, Public Rail Ownership Campaign. And like I kind of mentioned earlier, that's evolved into a coalition. So we've got rank and file railroad workers, we've got folks that are passenger rail advocates, people that live in trackside communities that are inhaling diesel fumes on a daily basis. We've been working with folks in East Palestine, and just basically anybody and everybody, labor organizations, progressive groups, anybody that wants to see this industry taken out of the hands of these unaccountable robber barons. They've all jumped on board, so it's not just an RWU campaign really anymore. It's its own monster now. It's in a good sense. It's the PRO campaign evolved into Public Rail Now, and we're very much inspired by the Plumb plan. So I'll just kind of mention, so the Plumb plan, the older button that I showed on the screen when we were talking about nationalization in World War I, it was the idea was to establish a tripartite system where the public, labor, and basically shippers or management would all have equal say in how the rail system was run. And so we kind of took that and made our own little button here for the present day, taking management out of it, but having labor, public, and planet. Because one of the big things that wasn't necessarily considered during the time of the Plumb plan was the crisis of climate change, and what the world's going to look like if we don't actually take steps to address that problem and make major changes to the socioeconomic and political structures of all these different countries, mostly Western democracies, quote unquote. But one of the, so for example, catenary electrification of the rail system in terms of addressing the climate crisis, that will never happen in private hands. They would have to spend way too much money than they're willing to. They're already unwilling to, spend any kind of capital on expanding just to meet capacity needs. So there's no way that they would ever electrify through catenary, which is the most effective and environmentally friendly way of electrifying the railroads. They would never do that. So that's one of the big goals with Public Rail Now is it's not just, let's just nationalize the rail system, it'll be better, but it's having this vision of what we can accomplish with public control of the rail system, including things like full catenary electrification, which would be huge. And again, so very much inspired by the Plumb Plan League, and what we foresee is the answer to the problems that we're facing with the privatized rail system, bring it under the control of the public and the people who actually do the work. It makes total sense. You know, I've been doing these interviews with railroad workers. We did this questionnaire and we've gotten, you know, over like 130 responses, and I've just been talking to these guys, and they know a hell of a lot more than the Class 1 rail robber barons do about how the rail system works, how it operates, what needs to happen. Okay, so it's a typical case of the workers know best, and that's kind of where we're going at it with from that perspective. And so it's an ambitious plan, but there's no other way. Like we were kind of talking about earlier with you know, addressing the problems of stock buybacks. Unless you actually take it away from them, it's not going to change. So that's where we're at with the Public Rail Now campaign. And I included this slide because, again, you know, in conversations you might have with folks, oh, that's a pie in the sky idea. Oh, that would be great if we could do that. You know, yeah, like, or you talk to people who they think everything the government touches turns to dirt. They just have like this public enterprise or anti-public sector mentality that's been kind of forced upon them over the, you know, past however many decades. But I wanted to include this because when you look at what's actually happening around the world, like, I'm very excited about what the Mexican government under the Morena party and President Sheinbaum has done, reversing the privatization of the Mexican rail industry. And even the UK, you know, under Margaret Thatcher, you know, absolutely satanic person. They privatized the rail system, and it was such a failure. You know, rates went up so much; they were gouging the customers, and it's like exactly what I've been describing here, as far as the degradation of the actual infrastructure itself and the quality of the rail system got so bad that it's an overwhelmingly popular thing there to say, yeah, we need to actually renationalize the rail system. And that's in the works right now. But I also wanted to include China and India as examples because these are countries that have completely nationalized rail systems, and they're already doing what I was talking about earlier as far as electrification. They are paving the way for a totally green rail system. China, I think, has over 70% of its rail system electrified. India is almost 100% electrified. And another reason I wanted to include these two countries is something that you hear from a lot of naysayers. Oh, well, you know, a national rail system might work somewhere like Switzerland, but the United States is just too big, or we've got too many people. And it's like, well, if China and India can do it, we can do it, you know? and that's totally setting aside, you know, if you're in a position to have this conversation with somebody, you can even bring up the old Soviet Union. So had a very successful, almost electrified rail system in a massive country. Okay, so the whole like the United States is too big and we've got too many people thing, and it's just crap. And at the bottom there, that's a very recent headline. U.S. freight workers say it's time to nationalize the railroad. So straight from the horse's mouth, straight from the people that do the work, it's time to nationalize the rail system. So just wanted to include this slide as well, just to show this isn't some crazy idea. Other people are already doing it, you know, and time for us to do the same. And so I have this slide as well that's just some links. So if you're in a union, we are really trying to get union support. There's a resolution template that you can use to introduce at a meeting or at a convention to get support for Public Rail Now. Even if you're, you know, may not be not necessarily involved in any kind of labor organization or union or what have you, you can still list your support as an individual. So if you have any family or friends that aren't really involved in the labor movement, but this is something that they would get behind, hey, you know, are you willing to send out an email, or are you willing to share something on social media? Like, there's all these different ways for folks to get involved. So yeah, we don't want to make it overwhelming for anybody. Everybody's got a role that they can play. So one of the big things that we've been trying to do is hosting public events, getting more people that may not necessarily not have ever dipped their toes into any kind of organizing or activism work in the past, but might be interested in at least hearing about this. So having in-person and virtual events, we're always looking for folks to host, again, in-person or virtual events. But even just talking to coworkers, family, friends, making this a topic of discussion in your community. If you are a practitioner of any kind of religion and you regularly attend services of any kind, talk to the folks that you're around. If you're at a farmer's market, any kind of space where you can talk to people about this. That's one of the big things about, like I was saying earlier, connecting this movement to the larger public, introducing these ideas to people who might otherwise not have interacted with them. And I also have like a PDF, a brochure that, if I'm not mistaken, Lou was like sent out already, but you can distribute literature. And if you don't have a printer, or if you want like actual like printed copies, let me know where to send them. I've got like a box of over 1,000 of them, so I'll send you a couple hundred, and you can pass them out wherever you're at. And we also have meetings every third Wednesday of the month at 8 p.m. Eastern time. So that link is there. It's open to anybody who's interested. And of course, if you have any questions, or you kind of are wondering, well, how can I get involved, or here's some things I'm thinking about. If you've got ideas for the campaign, my contact information is right there. You can email me, send me a text, call me. I'm more than happy to talk with anybody. So those are just some of the things that folks can do to get involved.
And with that, we'll break for our last round of questions and comments. I would just like to add quick, anybody on our mailing list will get an email put out by us on the third Wednesday every month to make those organizing meetings, as we send those out, as also trying to get more people involved.
I don't know if Public Rail now is involved with. I know that historically derailments have been swept under the rug to hide their railroad's culpability. Does Public Rail now have does it have a network of reporters to like keep on top of this and report whenever these derailments are happening, just to keep them, make sure there's pressure on the rail system?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two things. So the best way to keep tabs with that is RWU. They have a fantastic, it almost seems automated, but it's not. It's actually a guy named Mark that sends them out, and he's great. That keeps track of railroad fatalities and disasters. So if you sign up for the RWU newsletter, you can get that emailed to you as soon as something happens. So we have the Fallen Railroads Project, which is keeping tabs of railroad workers that have lost their lives on the job, as well as the Highball, which is the newsletter that comes out from RWU. That gets sent out, and we definitely keep track of all that. And like I mentioned earlier, we've been working with folks that are in the Justice for East Palestine and the Council for East Palestine, and those groups as well have kept track of not only what has happened in East Palestine and the struggles and hardships that people continue to deal with day to day in East Palestine, Ohio, but disasters elsewhere as well. And briefly, I'll say, like, I was in DC a couple months ago, actually over the summer, for an Institute for Policy Studies event that brought together folks who had survived the Bhopal chemical disaster, that the worst industrial catastrophe in history, in Bhopal, India, actually brought together folks who had survived that catastrophe and folks who had experienced the derailment in East Palestine. It was a beautiful thing to see, that internationalist solidarity. So that is absolutely something that we are keeping up with. And yeah, like I said, I think the best way to keep tabs on that would be sign up for the RWU newsletter, and you'll get that right to your email as soon as it happens.
Thank you. And we share a lot of our the Rail Workers United updates on labor today. I don't think we've shared the highball yet. I think it's something we got to get on, but you can also always check out Labor Today for a lot of the updates from RWU, as we view their work important and we want to make sure it gets as many eyes as possible.
Yeah, I know on a previous meeting that we were on with you, Adam, the topic of high-speed rail in America came up. And I remember you gave such a good answer of how any conversation about that just gets sidetracked to like Elon Musk and how it's like not even I forget exactly what you said, but why aren't we what's the deal with high-speed rail in America, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I mean that's a big question, but I'll do my best here. So the thing with high-speed rail is that it's a fine idea, but at the same time, there's already these sort of I'll give the example of precision scheduled railroading again. And what has happened over the past, several decades of as far as ripping up tracks. There was a time when, for example, they had double tracking in this country, where passenger rail had a track, freight rail had a track. Now they both use the same track. So all these delays that are happening with Amtrak, and even worse, there have been derailments that have happened on Amtrak because of the freight rail system. So high-speed rail, I'm not knocking it, but at the same time, there's the way that I think about it is, if we had just introduced something like double tracking and giving passenger rail its own tracks, we're not even there yet. So this idea of like high-speed rail is like, well, you could connect Vegas to LA or whatever, Reno to San Francisco, Cleveland to Buffalo, or Cleveland to Cincinnati, stuff like that. That's all well and good, but until we actually address the problem of this single track, that is something that I think will have to come later. I mean, we're still dealing with like bare bones of like, we don't even have tracks that are specifically for passenger rail, and I actually just read today that Elon Musk, you bring him up, which it makes my skin crawl to even say his name, but he's apparently going after any kind of attempts at a high-speed rail system, just trying to push his cars that blow up, from what I understand. So, yeah. So just to be clear, I'm not knocking anybody who is passionate about high-speed rail. I think that would be a great thing to see, but until we actually address these structural problems of what the rail system looks like in this country, the fact that we don't have double tracking, having these small high-speed rail connections from, city to city, I just think that's a secondary battle right now. But that's just my opinion.
Okay, an area of struggle is Parliament, in our case, the Congress. We need to try to get people to sponsor legislation. That's very important. I would suggest some way we contact Bernie Sanders' people. I think he would, I don't know if anybody tried, but he seems to be interested in things like that. But if we can get legislation on, then we have something to struggle around. Has anybody tried to get Bernie's people?
Yeah, so we've reached out to Bernie, and we've reached out to other nominally progressive legislators, and the only people who have actually gotten back to us and met with us are Senator Markey, his staff. So we're still waiting to hear back from Bernie, but we'll see.
About high-speed rail, that can be a leader. We are crazy Americans, and we love our toys. And when we see science fiction movies, we want all of the little goodies there. We expected already to have flying cars, but it didn't happen. So, I mean, quite frankly, high-speed rail is sexy. And I don't think there's any problem in promoting that, because then you get to say, well, here's what we need to do. But I can see more people saying, yeah, what's wrong with us? China and India have it. Why don't we have it? And I can see a lot more interest in that than just saying, well, let's just go for dual tracking and then we can bring up high-speed rail. I would start with high-speed rail, that I was saying, you ask for 100% when what you really want is 50%. Well, this is the same thing.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. I am loving the discussion happening, though, of course. When did the double tracking get pulled? Because anytime my mom tells me to go anywhere, she asks me if I could take a train, and it's usually like 4 times as expensive and maybe twice as long to get there as if I just drove a car. But I think, maybe when she was young, taking a train was actually a viable option to get around the country.
Oh my.
Yeah, so I'd love to know, but specifically, Adam, do you know when? I don't even. When did they pull double tracking?
If I'm not mistaken, it's actually relatively recently. I think 80s or 90s. Yeah.
Mhm.
But yeah, and to your point, yeah, I mean, I like taking the train, but yeah, that's one of the unfortunate things is like if you've got a place to be quickly, yeah, I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's an astronomical amount of hours of delays on Amtrak that are just strictly because of the freight rail. And it's one of those things where on paper the passenger rail is supposed to have precedent, but that's not how it operates. And as a matter of fact, there have been, I mean, right now even there are class action lawsuits that haven't been settled for years, because of freight rail disruptions of passenger rail. So it's and yeah, like again, like I think is right. Like I think it's if high speed rail is going to get people's attention, then yeah, absolutely. I was just saying that, yeah, like it wasn't that long ago where yeah, I got to catch the train, and that's actually a feasible way for me to get around. It's not like that anymore. I mean, I would still advocate taking Amtrak over flying, for personal reasons, but if you've got to be somewhere quick, you ain't taking Amtrak, So, and it's sad, but that's where we're at.
Before I
Yeah,
go to the closeout.
it was real easy. I just looked up Highball and I already have put in a subscription for the newsletter, the RW newsletter. Very easy to do.
Oh, great, thank you. I also want to add the front page of the little website has already been updated. You can get the Public Rail Now brochure. You're looking to hand it out, print it out and hand it out. It's right on the front page. We also added the link for people to click on to sign up for the email list to get in on the organizing meetings, as that is of course important as well. And here we go. And of course, the Harry Bridges School of Labor is presented by Labor United Educational League, and you can find us on various social media platforms. You can find us on Twitter or X at Lowell_US, on Instagram at Lowell.us, on Facebook at laborunited.lowell, and on YouTube at Labor United. And of course, you can find past recordings of the Harry Bridges School of Labor there. And you could also find our website at Lowell.us and our publication Labor Today at labortoday.lowell.us. And of course, Public Rail Now is also on various social media platforms. You can find it on Twitter or X, Instagram, and YouTube at Public Rail Now. On Facebook, just search Public Rail Now, and it should be easy to find up. And their website is publicrailnow.org. And of course, next month will be a follow-up to this class. We will be presenting on the Plumb plan itself. And you'll be able to see what the conditions were at that time. Just a quick hint, it's not that much different than today. You'll learn about the Plumb plan itself, as well as, of course, how it led to independent political action from labor. And that class will be a week later than normal because of New Year's Day. And it'll be Wednesday, January 8th at 9 p.m. Eastern. Repeated Saturday, January 11th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And our closeout song tonight, from our WU member JP Wright, Railroad Man.
I can sit